for your years of dedicated public service. We've been through decisions that were easy to make because we were able to expand opportunity, improve government. We've been through difficult decisions even as recently as last week on our multifamily transformation, and I can't thank you enough for your dedicated public service.
That was good. Thank you. The question starts as highlighted in my opening statement, but that doesn't. Your request assumes FHA receipts of $14 billion in FY15. This is $1.4 billion over this year's projection and a whopping $2.8 billion over CBO's latest estimate for 2015. If the CBO estimates remain this low, receipt scoring changes will create a significant hole in your budget. And I just ask you, what are the driving factors or changes in assumptions that resulted in a $1.4 billion increase over 14 and a $2.8 billion difference with CBO?
This is obviously very critical for being able to put a strong budget together. I think the key thing I would point to is we made two very significant changes last year in our premiums that significantly increased the return. So even though volume we're predicting to be lower, the returns are higher because of those premium changes. As I understand it, CBO has not yet factored those into the scoring, and so as they update their scoring, our hope is, obviously there are different other assumptions that may be different, but our hope would certainly be that we would see an increase based on those premium increases that we instituted last year.
And it's going to be very difficult to fill the holes, obviously, with $2.8 billion, and would cause some really difficult choices for us to make. I would ask that you talk to the CBO, share your assumptions and models, and report back to the subcommittee on the differences. You're not on the same page, not even on the same chapter, the way it looks, and it will have dire consequences if it isn't changed. There are a number of municipalities that are considering using eminent domain to acquire underwater performing mortgages and then refinance them to FHA products. I understand the city in California has mailed letters to mortgage holders offering to buy these mortgages at a discount and threatening to use eminent domain if the mortgage holders don't sell. Where do you stand on that issue? And just give us some input and guidance where.
Absolutely. I'm actually quite familiar with the eminent domain process, having led the agency in New York City that is responsible for eminent domain there. There's a fundamental legal question here that is up to the courts on whether the mortgages themselves generally, and then also specifically the mortgages on the homes that they're looking at, qualify under public purpose for eminent domain. That's a determination that needs to be and will be made by the court because not only of the regular process but the lawsuits that have been brought. So I think it's too early for us to take a legal position on this until the courts have acted. Having said that, to be clear, we would not provide financing at values that were above what the court determined the value to be. And I think that's one of the fears that have been out there, is that somehow eminent domain would bring the values down, write down these mortgages, and then somehow they could be refinanced at a significantly higher value by FHA. And that obviously would not be the case.
Wouldn't it create great uncertainty as far as the financial markets and
what I would say on this is that there is already the underlying system of eminent domain that exists on the properties themselves, and given that the mortgages sit beyond that, I don't believe that it creates substantial uncertainty. There is some uncertainty that it creates, which has to be resolved by the courts, but unfortunately I don't think there's any shortcut to the legal process that has to play out under these decisions, because ultimately eminent domain is a very specific local decision on whether this property does qualify under the rules of public purpose.
Well, it may be a local issue, but it has national consequences, and I think very significant as far as creditworthiness, interest rates, everything else. You're not, no sane investor is going to go into something, make a loan to someone if they know, in fact, the city can just decide that they can take away their house and lower the value.
The law requires in eminent domain that full value, market value, be paid, and so I think the greatest risk here is if we get a bad decision from the court.
But if they're taking a whole neighborhood, the market value is going to be dramatically changed.
If a correct decision were to happen, if they determine that it's possible, they would have to value it as it currently is, not as the decision might change the neighborhood.
In the FY bill, we had asked for a report by April 1st of 2014, which would be like past due. Yeah, on this issue as far as the implications. When do you know when we can see that?
I don't know immediately. Let me ask my team if we'll have it to you very shortly.
Okay, good. I appreciate that. Mr. Pasteur.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Donovan. I'm going to talk about CDBG. While the overall number for CDBG programs is about the same as last year's budget request, the funding request for formula grants to cities, counties, and states is at the lowest level since 1976. The CDBG program was the CDBG program was last reauthorized in 1994. Many things have changed in the last 20 years. Priorities have changed, funding has decreased, building methods have changed, so there's been a lot of changes in the last 20 years. In light of these changes, what can HUD do to ensure that the program is still responsive to the communities and their requests?
It's a terrific question, and first of all, to be very clear, we strongly support reauthorization of the program, and as we are approaching this major anniversary of the program later this year, we have undertaken a program that we call Moving CDBG Forward, an initiative where we reached out to more than 20 different sets of stakeholders, held forums around the country to get input and comments, and based on that, we've suggested a set of changes to CDBG. We'll be providing legislative language as part of our upcoming package to the committee, and basically it focuses on a few key things. First of all, to update the formula and the targeting of CDBG to make sure that we are reaching the neediest places. As you know, for example, Arizona, there's been enormous development in Arizona since the CDBG formula was created, and we really don't believe that the current formula best meets the needs of particularly places that have developed substantially over the last few decades. We also believe that there are ways that we can both streamline the program and improve its administration. For example, providing more flexibility to communities, particularly the smallest communities, to be able to form regional coalitions, to share back office functions, a range of things like that. And then there's also accountability to make sure that we're able to measure the impacts and ensure that CDBG is having the kind of impacts that we all want for it. So I look forward to discussing that. It's obviously a first step for us, and we wanted to be able to work closely with the committee on any potential changes this year.
In some cases, the money, especially for smaller rural communities, the money comes through the state, and then the state, and sometimes there's a lot of considerations that are used to determine what cities get what and what they don't. Is that something that you want to change, or is that something that you still want to keep in place?
Well, clearly, the state program is an important piece of it, and we're not suggesting that we move to a system where every local community is an entitlement community. On the other hand, if we provide more flexibility for communities to join together and reach a scale where they would qualify as an entitlement community, there would be more options for some of those smaller communities to come together.
I don't believe that reauthorization is probably a priority in this year's session. So would you look at some regulatory changes to bring about some of these changes where you can and where you can make the changes?
Absolutely, and in fact, one of the efforts around that was part of this moving CDBG forward outreach that we did was to identify things that we could do on an administrative basis or a regulatory basis to improve the program. So absolutely, that will be part of what we're undertaking. But we do want to discuss those with the committee as well and get your input, even if they're not, don't require legislative change.
So what's the timeline on celebrating the anniversary and bringing about some of these changes?
So we should have in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I would expect, the package of legislative changes, and that would be for the entire administration, but it would include the specifics of this language, and then to be able to work with you going forward over the summer, both on the legislative piece of this, but also on the regulatory piece.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
You're out of time.
Oh, well, just in time.
Thank you, Mr. Pastor. Ms. Herrera-Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up on that, what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the proposal is to be it's eliminating small grantees, which likely means that the small guys will have to compete for statewide CDBG funding, statewide grants. Is that accurate?
We do have, and in past years, there have been proposals, because there have been such significant reductions in CDBG, we now have some grantees operating with programs that are just a few $100,000, and literally it's extremely difficult for them to be able to keep up with the administrative and other changes. What we're proposing is to allow them the flexibility to be able to join with neighboring communities for administration and other steps that would allow them to keep that those grants.
You're not requiring that they do that in order to apply for these grants.
We're not requiring it, but we want to provide more options around that.
I think some of the challenges, part of the reason these are small communities is they're hundreds of miles from other communities, and so that's part of the reason. And a couple $100,000, though, isn't much in the scope of your budget. It's a ton of money for a small community that's applying for one of these grants. I mean, that's a tremendous asset. And I've heard from a number of my small communities that we need to protect, and I fully intend on helping protect their access to these things. That's part of why they don't. I mean, trust me, these small communities do band together where they can find efficiencies because they have to. But part of the reason this is such a valuable option for them is because, they're competing against large cities, and to require them this kind of to be on that same playing field seems to me to be putting those rural communities at a disadvantage.
We are putting barriers in the way of them being able to work together through CDBG and our other block grants, and that's one of the things that we want to change with these proposals. But I also think it's important that we recognize when we start to get to a scale of grants to communities where it's almost impossible for them to keep up with the requirements for accountability and reporting, that we risk wasting money that would be better spent if we can improve the program and create some of these efficiencies.
You're not going to grant. You're not going to let to a grantee who can't fulfill the administrative obligations. Correct? I mean, I'm sure that's part of letting a grant is they have to be able to fulfill everything. My point being, they're not going to be asking and applying for and you're not going to be giving it to them if they can't do it.
We do make the awards, and then they are required to meet requirements of the award.
Yeah.
And so it would be a many-year process to track, create accountability, remove funding. Our step is to actually revoke funding if they're not meeting those requirements.
Oh,
so we would be
absolutely.
awarding it to those communities.
Absolutely. My point is having worked on development for a small nonprofit, you don't get the award unless you can demonstrate you can fulfill the obligations and requirements of the award, generally, and I assume that's how you operate.
That's at the local level. It's a block grant, and it's made by formula to the local community, and then we will check if they are complying. So it's a somewhat different process in terms of our relationship with the state or local government than the state or local government with an individual grantee, such as a nonprofit.
Totally switching tracks, something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, PBRA. I kind of wanted to clarify, because I felt like after our last conversation, I was clear as mud as to where we were. Moving, and this is with regard to moving the calendar year. Now, moving the calendar year does not mean that you plan to end what looks like, it doesn't look like it appears to be somewhat underfunding, but we've had, I think, kind of a different perspective on that. Do you think it'll end? Do you think this is going to help end the uncertainty around kind of the reliability of the federal funding felt by the folks, the owners, the managers, the lenders, and the residents of these properties?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. We would not be proposing it if we didn't believe that this was a way to try to get the program back to a stable and clearer funding base, to eliminate some of the uncertainty, and by doing that, actually decrease the cost of financing and increase investment into the homes and communities of the families that depend on it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lowy, welcome.
Why, thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome.
Thank you.
In the wake of Superstorm Sandy, a number of people took out SBA loans to quickly repair damages to their businesses. After the disaster aid package was passed months later, a lot of these same people also applied for CDBG DR funding, but was subsequently denied because they weren't allowed to receive money from both programs. A number of these small business owners now feel taken advantage of by the federal government because they aren't allowed to secure grant assistance. We obviously can't fault small business owners for not postponing repairs to their businesses until Congress had done its job and passed the supplemental. Has HUD considered re-examining this rule so that under certain circumstances, small business owners can receive funding from both programs?
Yes. In fact, we've had many discussions with not only New York State, but the other grantees, and we've clarified this in two ways. One, that if there are additional needs beyond those that were funded by the SBA loan, absolutely they're eligible to get CDBG above and beyond the SBA loan. Second, if for some reason the circumstances have changed and they are unable to repay an SBA loan, if it would create risks for them in terms of the future of the business, we can replace that SBA loan with CDBG. But I want to be clear, what we're trying to achieve here, we have limited resources, and if we have businesses that have an ability to repay a loan, if they can afford a 2% or a 5% interest rate or whatever it might be, we want to make sure we're targeting the CDBG to the neediest businesses. So replacing SBA with CDBG assistance would be a case-by-case decision made by the grantee. We've made it clear that that's allowed. That's in fact happening. But we do want to make sure that the CDBG is targeted to the neediest businesses.
But it is possible.
Yes,
so that
absolutely.
Makes sense. On rental assistance, similar to last year's budget request, the FY 2015 budget includes a request to expand the rental assistance demonstration program. The program allows PHAs to modernize, preserve existing housing by leveraging outside capital. The budget request includes $10 million in funding, eliminates the 60,000 unit cap, extends the program through FY 2017, and currently the program is authorized at no more than 60,000 units, is set to expire at the end of the calendar year. In New York, we've had tremendous success with this program. We've utilized it to help renovate and preserve over 1,300 units of affordable rental housing. Mr. Secretary, can you give us an update on the first round of RAD projects? What kinds of projects are you seeing? What kinds of markets are they in? Do you think there is sufficient demand to support a program expansion?
Not only do I believe there's demand to expand the program, we already have, as of the end of last year, 3 times the demand that we can meet. So 180,000 units have applied. I think it's very important to recognize that this is not only benefiting the residents of public housing, but the $1.8 billion in capital that will be generated on those first 60,000 units under the cap, and that is at no cost to the taxpayer, no additional cost whatsoever to the taxpayer, has created or will create 34,000 jobs, primarily in construction, but in a range of other areas as well. So this is a win-win. It's creating jobs, it's creating better housing, and it's lowering costs in the long term, because when you fix the roof today, obviously you don't have to do more major repairs down the line. So we believe, given the demand that we've seen, 180,000 units, that it would make great sense to expand the cap. Just the 180,000 units we have in would be an additional $6 billion of capital that would come in. So it would roughly triple, more than triple, the number of jobs that would be created as well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I'm sorry, one other thing I just quickly mentioned. Interestingly, there was early concern that RAD would be reaching the largest housing authorities. In fact, we're seeing that the smaller housing authorities are disproportionately represented. In other words, smaller housing authorities are more likely to have applied for RAD and to be using the program. And so it really is reaching, to your question, which I forgot to answer, it is reaching all parts of the country, but particularly smaller housing authorities, smaller towns, rural communities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Good morning.
Secretary Donovan. Vacant, foreclosed, and abandoned property has been a serious problem for communities around Ohio and certainly across the country. And since the downturn of the housing market, this problem has become crippling to some responsible homeowners. Studies have found that vacant properties have reduced prices of nearby homes between as much as $8,600 to $17,000 per property in certain cities. These properties are often magnets for crimes like murder and drugs, and they increase public safety costs. I mentioned previously, I support creative solutions to the abandoned housing crisis. Can you elaborate on some of the programs in the administration's budget with funds usable for this demolition? In the future, do you have any programs in mind that would be restructured for demolition purposes, given the current need?
Absolutely. I think you're well aware, Congressman, that the neighborhood stabilization effort, which was part of the Recovery Act, was enormously successful in being able to spur not just renovation of vacant homes, but job creation and lifting values of surrounding properties. It's the reversing the cycle, the very cycle that you described. And so given the budget constraints and the fact that we don't have continued investment in the neighborhood stabilization program, we've been looking for creative ways to continue to spur that kind of development. One is using repayments of neighborhood stabilization funds. Communities are now taking those and reinvesting those to do more of that work. We've also been working with communities under CDBG and other traditional programs that we have to provide flexibility to increase investment in those types of properties, and even in some cases demolition of those properties. And we've also provided a lot of flexibility, including recently to Ohio, through the hardest hit funds that are at Treasury, to use those for blight removal activities. And so those are a few. We've also begun, and this is something that's important for Ohio as well, to use our FHA resources in new ways. We've been doing targeted neighborhood stabilization loan sales and other efforts that are trying to make sure that FHA isn't part of the problem with our vacant or foreclosed homes.
I don't know if you're familiar with Jim Rackakis. I guess. And there's some things going on in Slavic Village you may want to take a look at. And now, technically, that's in Congresswoman Fudge's district.
Yep.
We've been working together along with Congressman Ryan, and because I think it's very important. The idea that you take out the houses that have bad bones, for lack of a better word, and make sure those are removed, because you don't want to necessarily debilitate the neighborhood, but you certainly want to make sure that the people who are there and working to stabilize the neighborhood stay, and the houses that can be rehabbed are rehabbed. And they're doing a thing that's all private at the moment that's a very interesting, might be worth you looking into.
We'll follow up with your office right after the hearing.
Sure. Yeah, I have a few more. Following up on some testimony that you gave in response to a question from our esteemed chairman last week, you mentioned that you were seeking a more efficient contracting model and project-based Section 8 program. You went on to paraphrase the language that your agency has requested in its budget request concerning this program, where the procurement process for the program would not be a formal competitively bid process, but instead utilize a less formal NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability. During the testimony, you mentioned that using a less formal, and in my view, less competitive procurement process was confirmed by one judge in a prior court. As you know, the prior court's decision was overturned by a federal court of appeals. Can you comment on the overturning of this decision?
We believe the decision is wrong, and that the court didn't look closely enough of the specifics of Section 8. Just as we provide HAP contracts directly to housing authorities, we believe under the project-based Section 8 program, we have clear authority, and that was what the earlier court confirmed, to be able to enter directly into those types of contracts. The problem, we believe, with the full procurement process is that it will not allow us to take into account sufficiently the importance of the ability of the partner that we have to work with other sources of affordable housing funding and to include a mission component on preservation of those units in the same way. Just to be very specific, we have traditionally done this kind of work with state housing finance agencies and local housing authorities. We actually created a great deal of competition by allowing these teams to cross state lines. They do subcontract with private entities, but the problem is if we go to a purely procurement process, not only will it greatly lengthen the process, make it more complex, it will also likely lead to places where we have no public involvement in the oversight of these properties, where we wouldn't have state housing finance agencies, we wouldn't have housing authorities, and we would lose the ability to partner with them where they can bring tax credits, other resources that will be able to better preserve these properties. So we think there is great risk in doing this in a way that will be bad in the long run for these properties. And so we want to work cooperatively with the committee to make sure that we're clear about the flexibility that we have in doing this.
I see that I'm out of time, so I will.
Thank you. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the subcommittee.
Good to be back.
I want to talk to you about a persistent problem having to do with the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS program, HOPWA. The allocation formula, the allocation of formula funds has been an ongoing issue since the inception of HOPWA almost, but the initial arrangement was that 75% of the funds have been distributed using the cumulative number of AIDS cases as reported by the CDC, including those who have died. I'm sure you're well aware of this. HOPWA was enacted within 4 months of the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, and both programs relied to some degree on the cumulative number of AIDS cases in distributing funding to eligible jurisdictions. After all, that was the data that CDC reported, cumulative data. Since then, however, Congress has made some prudent adjustments to the Ryan White program. The program now uses the number of people actually living with AIDS and HIV. That formula better represents the need. It allows states like mine and other southern and rural states to receive funding to better address the changing HIV epidemic, and we do have a very serious problem. The HOPWA formula, however, has remained the same. That's what I want to ask you about. Both Congress and numerous presidential administrations have acknowledged the disparity. Following the first change to the Ryan White program formula in 1997, the GAO released a report regarding the performance of the HOPWA program, in which it recommended that HUD look at recent changes to the formula used by the Ryan White program to, quote, determine what legislative revisions are needed to make the HOPWA formula more reflective of current AIDS cases. In response to that report, the House Appropriations Committee included the GAO language in its report accompanying the '98 HUD Appropriations Act, directed HUD to make recommendations to the Congress about an updating of the formula. Additionally, the administration's National HIV/AIDS Strategy, released in July of 2010, stated that HUD would work with Congress to develop a plan including seeking statutory changes if necessary to shift to HIV/AIDS case reporting as a basis for formula grants for HOPWA funding. The four most recent HUD congressional budget justifications echoed this goal. So, since the release of that strategy document, HUD has solicited comments from the policy advocates, grantees, HOPWA clients about how and to what degree the formula might be changed. In other words, you've done your work, and I commend you for it.
Thank you.
Congress must act. I'm going to be urging the committee to include report language to this effect. In the meantime, I do want to commend you for continuing to advocate for HOPWA formula changes, and I would appreciate your comments on this aspect of your budget submission.
Well, Congressman, I think you've said it well. This is an urgent priority that we change the formula. And to be very frank, the formula simply doesn't make any sense anymore. To have a formula that is based on not just cumulative cases of AIDS, so in other words, in the entire history of the disease, every single case that's happened over time is now built into the formula. It also, the formula was created at a time where we never imagined that we would have people living with HIV but not full-blown AIDS. And so that whole group is left out. And I say this as a New Yorker and someone who implemented these programs at the local level. New York and a very few set of other communities benefit greatly from this outdated, nonsensical formula, and they benefit at the expense of communities represented by every one of you here today that simply doesn't make the right amount of funding to match the real needs that are on the ground today in communities around the country. So this is something that I would very much urge the committee to look at, the legislative proposal that's in our budget, and to pass it this year.
Well, as you say, this formula antedates the advances we've made in HIV/AIDS diagnosis and treatment, keeping people alive. It simply doesn't match the realities of the current epidemic, the current spread of the disease. So I thank you for including this in your budget request. I very much hope Congress can act on it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Dent is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Secretary.
Good morning.
Last week, I appreciated your comments. I asked you about some of HUD's regulatory authority to reduce administrative burdens and help them save some tax dollars. And I mentioned North Dakota and Virginia had some issues there, and you had offered to meet with some of my folks. And I just want you to know that the Allentown Housing Authority will be in touch with your office, and we'll follow up with your staff afterwards just to try to follow through on that. So appreciate your comments from last week on that issue.
Great. Thank you.
On the CDBG issue, Ms. Herrera-Butler, I think, touched on it briefly, but your FY14 budget request included proposed legislation to revise the entitlement qualification criteria for CDBG. The changes included possible elimination of grandfathering and a minimum grant threshold for entitlement communities. Your proposal for FY15 shows that feedback from listening sessions with grantees would be included in any such proposal going forward. Secretary, what are your new proposals for revising CDBG entitlement criteria? And can you also share some of the insights and recommendations you received from these listening sessions?
So I would really point to two things. One is, we obviously heard concerns along the lines that Congresswoman mentioned, that smaller communities do like to have direct access to that funding. So what we included was a set of options, more flexibility for communities to team together on administration, on oversight, on a bunch of these expenses, so that we could create a way for them to keep the funding directly, but still meet the needs, I think, to run the programs. You talked about efficiency and savings, to run the programs more effectively and more efficiently. The second thing I would say is that we did look at a number of ways to make the program simpler to use and less costly for grantees that came out of those sessions. Things like synchronizing planning and reporting cycles, and other kinds of options and flexibilities in the administration of the program. And so there are a number of those that will be included with the legislative language as well.
Were those some of the insights and recommendations that you gathered?
Absolutely.
From
They
the,
came directly from
the
those
sessions?
conversations.
Okay, thank you. And one final question or comment. I'd like to discuss a casework issue related to my office that we spent several months working on, which I discussed briefly with you last December. There's a manufactured housing operation in Pennsylvania that had their operation shut down by HUD on December 3rd, 2013, for what appears to have been a clerical error. The company's leadership acted, I thought, pretty quickly to obtain the necessary paperwork from HUD, but found this to be a needlessly difficult task. They were given little guidance regarding their error and how to rectify it. The prolonged delays resulted in workers being laid off from their jobs until the paperwork came through, and they were finally permitted to get back to work. It seems to me there's room for improving some of the HUD's communications with the private sector. And Secretary, I guess the question is, what is HUD doing to improve its customer service and ensure that no company is unfairly harmed by bureaucratic intransigence while doing their due diligence to comply with department rules and policies?
Well, Congressman, I want to thank you directly for your intervention here. To be frank, this was an issue where, certainly from our perspective, it wasn't just a clerical error. This was something where there were some significant concerns about the structural integrity of this proposed sort of alternative design that had been approved in the past. There had been changes made, and the company, we had reached out a number of times to this company to try to get this resolved without success, and it was only when your office became involved that we were able to move this process forward. I'm pleased to say we have resolved that, as you know, that workers are back at work, but we certainly saw this as an issue where we'd taken the steps, we'd done outreach and had not been successful in being able to get the company to comply, and we will continue to try to work with them. And I'd be happy if you have specific suggestions of where you think our communication fell down to try to correct those.
Yeah, and I thank you and the staff too. Yeah, the company had reached out to me to try to help move this along, and things did get better after we did intervene and your office got involved, and I appreciate that. But I think there is some room. We'll follow up with you after the meeting about
Yep.
how to I just some things we thought could have been done a little bit better. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Dent. Mr. Quigley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Mr. Secretary.
It's good to be back.
Following up on Mr. Price's questions about HOPWA and the new formula, you are absolutely right in what a dramatic difference is in how important this could be to my community, the HIV/AIDS community in Chicago. Can you, because they're so interested, and so am I, can you give us a little more insight as to the timing and when we might see details of the formula, and a little more information about how this formula is going to be different from the existing?
The legislative language we proposed, I was just confirming, it was actually part of the budget that we published. We have a further legislative package that will be coming, but the specifics of the language on this proposed change was included in the budget itself.
When might you see the new language that you just referenced, the one that's still to be released?
That new language, I would expect to be out. It will be for the entire administration. I would expect in the next 6 to 8 weeks. But again, I don't. The key language for HOPWA was included in the budget that we did publish. So I don't expect any additional proposals in this further legislative.
Change that language at all?
We've spent a lot of time on this. As Congressman Price referenced, there's been a lot of focus from the CDC, from a range of organizations around the country on this. We think we've reached the right proposal in the legislative language based on those discussions, and so we really hope that the committee will take it up and pass it this year.
Thank you. The Office of HIV/AIDS Housing, does it currently have some vacancies in that office?
It does. We are also, we have been working to try to create a better alignment between the office that works on HIV and AIDS and our office that works on homelessness, because we see increasingly a significant overlap in those populations, and we believe better coordination between those offices will help us better serve those with HIV and AIDS who are particularly vulnerable to homelessness.
And how will that affect your filling the existing vacancies? You're just trying to get people who are going to work on both issues, or you're going to change the whole system and have them coordinate more?
Effectively, what we're doing is having the HIV/AIDS office report within the Office of Special Needs Programs to the same office director, which will give us better coordination and allow us, frankly, to use more resources that are within the homelessness office to be able to expand our focus on HIV and AIDS, and not only better coordinate, but to have just more bodies, more folks that are working on it and able to focus on the HIV/AIDS programs.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quigley. We just got called for votes, which will have to end the hearing this morning, but I think we can go about another 10 minutes probably, so that maybe I'll get one round and the ranking member. Mr. Secretary, performance on the CDBG grants allocated for Hurricane Sandy has been painfully slow. And after a year and a half, few homes have been rebuilt, and it's looking like it'll be years before billions of dollars in recovery grants for infrastructure and public services will actually be put to use. Perhaps even more frustrating, there are billions of dollars that remain unallocated by HUD, while eligible grantees from 2011, 2012, and 2013 storm seasons await action by the federal government. Exactly how much funding remains unallocated, and why is HUD still holding those funds at the agency level over a year and a half after Sandy and 4 months after the last eligible storm would have made landfall?
At this point, there is about $4 billion that remains unallocated. We look forward to meeting with the committee very shortly to discuss that. Basically, the issue was, because this allocation covered storms up through December of 2013, we needed to wait for the final information about the impact of those storms, and particularly, as you know, CDBG goes to unmet needs, so we had to look at what needs of those storms were being met by FEMA, SBA, other programs. We now have full data on those storms and the unmet needs, and we're prepared to meet with you in the coming days to discuss with you a proposed way to allocate those remaining funds.
It's my understanding there are a lot of eligible grantees from other storms besides Hurricane Sandy that were not treated equally with the unmet needs. And been provided to those non-Sandy storm, or what percentage of unmet need has been provided to the non-Sandy storm grantees, and is that the same percentage as the Sandy storm?
In the proposal that we want to discuss with you, we would treat them exactly the same as the way the Sandy grantees have been treated. There have been some updates and changes that have been made over the last few years in the way that we allocate funds.
The question is, I mean, currently,
Currently,
I mean, is Sandy a percentage much greater than the other ones, or are you?
currently it is somewhat higher for Sandy because we've added in, at the direction of the legislation, resilience needs and other needs that were not included
That was my next
before.
question.
And again, we're literally at the point where we want to sit down and talk through with you a way to make sure that we are being very even-handed about the needs across the country.
Well, grants to the Sandy communities were considerably higher than other grantees because of your, with their unmet needs estimates with the multiplier you call the resiliency. Has this ever been done before, and do you plan to offer non-Sandy guarantees, the same multiplier? Yeah, this is supposed to have unmet needs. It's not a climate change program. Has this ever been done before in the other communities?
It is an approach that is different from the approach that we've used in the past. Frankly, I think it's a better approach, and I think if you talk to grantees, they're very clear that the problem is they're often funded just to build back what was there before. And I think in particular, Cedar Rapids is a community that was hit very hard and wants to do the right thing in terms of building community-level flood protection, and that kind of need hasn't been funded through CDBG before. And so what we want to do...
offering them resiliency?
As I mentioned, we look forward to sitting down with you literally within the next few days to be
How
able to
can you
present to
offer
you a proposal of how to do that.
Sandy communities this and not other ones?
Because these formulas have changed over time. As a result of the work that was done in the Sandy Task Force, we identified what we thought was a better way to allocate CDBG, and we want to now go back and make sure that we're treating all of those communities in an even-handed way. The other thing I would just say is recognize that when allocations were made to those earlier communities, they were much smaller. We didn't know there was going to be a Sandy allocation of the scale that was made. And so this is a chance to go back and supplement earlier appropriations, which in terms of meeting unmet needs were much, much smaller. And so had we had a crystal ball and known that this allocation was coming, we might have looked at doing something different. We didn't, obviously, and this is a chance to be able to go back and make sure that it's being even-handed. I very much understand your concerns. We believe you're right to make sure that we're doing this in an even-handed way, and we do have a proposal we want to share with you on that.
Thank you. Mr. Pasteur.
Mr. Secretary, last year I asked you about your IT. You had a number of people look at your IT and say that it needed to upgrade it, you needed to modernize it. So the question is, how far along are you with the system you have now? And at the last hearing, you talk about a transformation where you were going to integrate to PHAs, and so in the budget request, how far does it get you? And is there also programming for cybersecurity?
Yep. So I think we have made real progress working with the committee. For example, our NGMS system, which will consolidate and improve our oversight of rental assistance, has made significant progress. We've implemented this past year the first two components of that system. We're also making real progress on our FHA transformation technology initiative. So we are making progress. I will say that we are concerned that the level of funding these past few years has not been substantial enough for us to move these key projects as quickly as we would like, and we do want to discuss with the committee the ability to make sure we have adequate funds for new system development, not just maintenance of funds. And this goes directly to your question about cybersecurity. We have made real advances. For example, we've acquired software that will allow us to scan every outgoing email for what we call PII, personal identified information. But if we are not able to upgrade these systems overall, we will continue to have unsupported systems that do not have the latest in security. And so that is an issue we're concerned about in terms of the overall budget for developing new systems. Thank you.
With the votes on the floor, I think we're going to have to adjourn the hearing. I know there's a lot of questions that people have that'll be for the record. We'd ask that if we could get the responses back as quickly as possible. Within at least 30 days, we're going to be starting to write the bill markup here pretty quickly. So
absolutely,
we appreciate your efforts to make that happen. Thank you very much. I just this will be the last hearing. I know you hate that.
I'm going to reconsider.
I
I'm having second thoughts here. I want to see Donovan one more time.
don't know about my people at home are pretty well accepted. But I just want to publicly thank Mr. Pastor. Been a great friend, ranking member, for all your cooperation, and it's been a real treat and an honor to have this opportunity to serve here with you. So,
Well, Mr. Secretary, the people asked me why I decided to retire. I could not bear being up here 1 year without Chairman Latham, and so I thought I'd hang it up. But I have to tell you that I've really enjoyed his leadership, and obviously we've had a friendship for many years, and thank you, and thank you, Chairman Latham, for your leadership and your friendship.
Thank you both
very
for your leadership and friendship. It's meant a lot to communities around the country.
okay, very good. Thank you. The hearing is adjourned.